Back in 1965, half a dozen teenage boys decided they'd had enough of their boarding school in Tonga. They wanted adventure. They wanted freedom. So they did what any restless teenager might dream of doing. They took a fishing boat that wasn't theirs and headed out into the Pacific Ocean. They had barely any food, nothing to help them navigate, and honestly, no real strategy. Just a lot of confidence and the kind of fearlessness that only young people have. But the ocean doesn't care about confidence. Within just a few days, they found themselves wrecked on a tiny empty island called Atta. What happened next wasn't the chaos you might expect. Instead, these boys created something remarkable. They survived for over a year through teamwork, smart thinking, and sheer determination. Back at St. Andrew's College, their Catholic boarding school near the capital city, these boys were just regular students. They were at that age where your body grows faster than your common sense, where boredom feels unbearable and consequences seem like distant problems. The oldest boy was Shaun Fatawa, just 16 years old. His friends were Stephen Fata Latu, Kolo Fekatoa, Shaun Felipe Tatawo, Mano Tatawo, and the baby of the group, David Tatita Sola, who was only 13. They all came from Hava, a small island where life was tough and everyone worked hard. But boarding school felt like prison to them. Endless schedules, strict rules for silence, and lessons that seemed pointless. When teenagers feel trapped, they start looking for ways out. Their plan was simple, maybe too simple. They'd sneak away, sail across the ocean, and reach Fiji or maybe even New Zealand if luck was on their side. It wasn't a smart plan, but that's exactly why it appealed to them. They weren't trying to be heroes. They just wanted to feel free, even if it was reckless. They knew exactly which boat to take. A local fisherman named Tenanila, Uhila, owned it, and the boys didn't like him much. He was grumpy and bossy, the kind of adult that kids naturally rebel against. One evening, they put their plan into action. They quietly took his boat and slipped out of the harbor. Nobody noticed. Nobody stopped them. They were just 6 kids on a small boat, heading into the unknown with way too much confidence. For supplies, they packed 2 bags of bananas, some coconuts, and a small gas burner. That's it. No map, no compass, no navigation tools whatsoever. Their plan for finding their way: hope for the best, look at the stars, and assume the ocean would be kind to them. At first, everything seemed fine. The weather was good. The water was calm. They sailed into the darkness feeling that electric thrill of doing something they absolutely shouldn't be doing. The cool night air felt amazing. The gentle rocking of the boat made them drowsy. One after another, they fell asleep. That simple decision almost cost them their lives. A storm hit hard and fast. The ocean turned violent. They woke up to waves crashing over them, to wind that sounded alive and furious. David, the youngest one, would later laugh about how the older boys only brought him because he actually knew how to sail. But when the storm hit, even his skills weren't enough. He fought with the sail, but the wind just ripped it to pieces like it was tissue paper. Then their rudder snapped off. They couldn't steer anymore. The boat just became floating wreckage with 6 terrified boys clinging to it. For 8 straight days, they drifted aimlessly. There's something uniquely cruel about being surrounded by water when you're dying of thirst. Water stretches endlessly in every direction, but you can't drink a single drop. Their food disappeared fast. Their mouths became painfully dry and cracked. They learned to watch the sky like their lives depended on it, because they did. When rain finally came, it wasn't much. They broke open coconuts and used the shells as makeshift cups, desperately catching whatever drops they could. They divided the water carefully, showing a discipline their teachers would have been shocked to see. One tiny sip when the sun came up, another when it went down. Fishing seemed like the obvious answer, but the equipment they had was useless. The ocean wasn't going to give up its food easily. Hunger and thirst broke them down to nothing but raw feeling. The burn of salt on skin, the relentless sun, the sick feeling in their stomachs, muscles cramped from holding on too long. On day 8, something appeared in the distance. Land. Atta Island. From far away, it looked like they were saved. Up close, it looked like a nightmare of rocks, cliffs, and sharp coastline. Atta is mostly steep mountains with sides that drop off dangerously. Getting onto the island wasn't gentle. It was violent. The boys crashed their destroyed boat onto the rocks. They got beaten up badly, covered in cuts and bruises. The boat fell completely apart. But they made it. They were alive. Getting fully onto the island took them about a day and a half. The ocean holds onto you even after it's done trying to kill you. When they finally dragged themselves onto solid ground and collapsed, they were too exhausted to feel anything except relief. They found a cave and crawled inside to sleep. The island had a dark history. Long ago, families had lived there. They had gardens, animals, a whole community. Then slave traders came and took everyone away. The island was left empty, haunted by what had happened. But the boys weren't thinking about any of that. They were focused on one thing: not dying. Sione and Stephen, the two oldest boys, naturally became the leaders. Though leadership on a deserted island isn't about being popular. It's about staying calm and knowing what needs to be done. One focused on practical stuff. What to do next, where to look for things, how to organize their days. The other one kept everyone's spirits up, led them in prayer, reminded them that giving up was not an option. They prayed together regularly. Not because prayer would magically build shelter or create water, but because it helped them deal with their fear. These boys knew almost nothing about surviving in the wilderness. They'd grown up in modern Tonga, surrounded by people, stores, regular life. On Ada, their old life felt like a distant dream. The island didn't care that they were students. It only cared if they could learn fast enough to stay alive. They found a small rocky overhang and made crude beds underneath it. It wasn't comfortable, but it protected them from the elements. Water was still their biggest problem. They carved out hollows in tree trunks so rainwater could slowly collect inside them. It was a homemade water storage system that took days to gather even a little bit worth drinking. Coconuts helped, but not nearly enough. When you're desperate, you do things you never imagined. The boys climbed the dangerous cliffs to catch seabirds. They needed them not just for meat, but for liquid. When water was scarce, they drank the bird's blood. Without any way to make fire, they ate the meat raw. This wasn't romantic or adventurous. It was grim, basic survival. Fire became their main goal. Every single day, they tried to create it. The method was brutally basic. Rubbing wood against wood over and over. They scraped and dragged and rubbed until their hands were covered in blisters, until they'd see a tiny bit of smoke that gave them hope, then watch that hope die. And the next day, they'd start all over again. Fire meant more than just warmth and cooked meals. Fire was a signal that any passing ship might see. Fire was proof they were still human, still fighting. As weeks became months, they learned an important lesson. Survival is so much easier when you're not constantly fighting with the people around you. Sure, they argued sometimes. Hunger and stress and fear make people snap at each other. But when tempers got hot, they walked away from each other instead of making things worse. They didn't hold grudges. They apologized when they were wrong. They shared responsibilities fairly. Nobody got special treatment, and nobody was left to struggle alone. When Stephen had a terrible accident and broke his leg falling off a cliff, it could have been a death sentence. They had no medical supplies, no doctors, no painkillers. But Kolo took charge. He set the broken bone as carefully as he could, using sticks as a splint and strips of cloth to hold everything in place. They all took care of Stephen during the long, painful recovery. When he could finally stand up and walk again, it felt like a victory for all of them. Meanwhile, the island had surprises waiting. As they explored further, they climbed to the top of one of the flat mountains and found ruins from the old village. There they discovered plants they could eat, things like yucca and other vegetables. Even more amazing, they found chickens. These were wild descendants of the birds that the original villagers had left behind years ago. The chickens had multiplied on their own. The boys started catching them at night, turning it into a fun game to keep their morale up. Eventually, they managed to capture and keep about 200 chickens. The birds gave them eggs, which meant reliable protein, without risking their lives climbing cliffs. They were smart about the flock, only killing and eating a chicken when bad weather made hunting seabirds too dangerous. They started thinking long-term, not just about what would feed them today, but what would keep feeding them for weeks and months. At some point, they built a raft and tried to escape. It made sense when you're desperate and homesick. Anything seems better than just waiting and hoping. But they still had no compass, no map, no real understanding of ocean currents. The raft fell apart about a mile from shore. They had to swim back, completely exhausted and defeated. Looking back, that failed escape might have saved their lives. The ocean that had nearly killed them once was still out there, waiting. After a year had passed, their hope changed. It wasn't bright and urgent anymore. It became quieter, more accepting. They started living as if Ada might be their home forever. They built better, more permanent shelters. They replanted and cared for the old gardens near the ruins. They divided up all the daily chores, always working in pairs. That way, nobody was ever alone for too long, and nobody carried too much weight on their shoulders. They kept the schedules. They exercised every day, understanding that laziness was just another way of giving up. They even made a badminton court and held regular tournaments, as if the rules of a game could bring order to a world that had lost all its normal rules. During one of their explorations, they found human bones, probably the remains of one of the last people to stay on Ada after everyone else was taken or ran away. The boys gathered the bones and gave this unknown person a proper burial with a funeral service. They prayed for him and for themselves. Even stranded and isolated, they insisted on maintaining their humanity and dignity. Back in the regular world, life went on without them. Ships sailed past the island without noticing. Families grieved. On their home island of Tongatapu, everyone believed the boys were dead. Funerals were held. People mourned. When there's nothing else you can do, grief is how communities respond. In September 1966, a man named Peter Warner was sailing his ship, the Just David, back from Tonga. Warner was young, ambitious, and determined to live life on his own terms. As his ship approached Ada, one of his crew members thought he heard a human voice. Warner figured it was just seabirds, but he agreed to take a closer look anyway. As they got nearer, Warner noticed burn marks on the rocks. Clear evidence of fire. Fires don't usually start by themselves on uninhabited islands. Those marks meant people. Warner stayed cautious at first. He'd heard stories about escaped prisoners being abandoned on remote islands. Stories meant to keep sailors careful. Then suddenly, 6 figures jumped into the water and started swimming frantically toward the ship. Their hair was long and wild. They had no clothes left, worn away by time and the harsh environment. They must have looked frightening, but they weren't acting crazy. They reached the ship and spoke to Warner in perfect English. They explained that they'd been missing for over a year. They weren't even completely sure how long it had been. Back at their camp, they'd been keeping track of days on a slate board. Later, everyone discovered they were only off by 2 days. After everything they'd been through, that kind of accuracy is almost impossible to believe. Warner immediately radioed Tonga with incredible news. He'd found 6 boys on Ada who claimed they'd run away from school. On the other end, there was stunned silence, then emotion. The radio operator's voice reportedly cracked with feeling. These boys had been declared dead. People had already held funerals for them. If this was real, it was nothing short of a miracle. Warner brought them back to Tongatapu. You'd think relief and joy would be the end of the story. It wasn't. Tenanila Uhila, the fisherman whose boat they'd stolen, hadn't forgotten. The law doesn't care much about context. Stealing is stealing. The boys were arrested and put in jail. Warner thought this was absolutely absurd. These kids had survived 15 months on an empty island, and now they were being punished? He decided to help. Warner came up with a plan. He'd help make a documentary about their incredible story and use the money to pay for the stolen boat. He paid the debt. The boys were set free. Families were reunited. Parents got to hold sons they'd already said goodbye to forever. Doctors examined the boys and couldn't believe what they found. Not only were they alive and relatively healthy, but Stephen's broken leg, which had been set on that island using just sticks and hope, had healed almost perfectly. It was a small medical miracle, achieved not with modern medicine, but with simple care and patience. Just weeks after being rescued, the boys went back to Ada with Warner to film the documentary. The island that had nearly killed them had also, in a strange way, taught them and shaped them. In 1966, the documentary aired on Australian television. Warner was celebrated as a hero. The King of Tonga, King Taufa'au Tupou even gave him official fishing rights in Tongan waters as a reward for an act that started with simple curiosity about some burn marks. Years passed and the boys scattered across the world. Kolo Fekitoa died in 2017 at the age of 71. The others built lives in Australia, the United States, and New Zealand, carrying with them a story that sounds like legend but actually happened. Kolo kept a guitar they'd made from a coconut. The song they wrote on Ada didn't disappear. It survived just like they did. Ada itself remains empty to this day. The original residents were violently taken away, and the land never got its people back. In their documentary, the boys express hope that one day people from Tonga might return and make Ada a living community again. Not as stranded kids drinking bird blood to survive, but as people choosing to build a home there. So far, that hope hasn't come true. The cliffs still stand. The ruins continue to weather and crumble. The island waits, patient and indifferent, the way islands always do. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. These boys weren't saved by becoming wild animals. They were saved by refusing to act like animals. They created rules when nobody was forcing them to. They took care of the injured person. They separated when they got angry instead of fighting. They always worked in pairs. They exercised, they sang songs. They kept their fire burning for months and months on end. Not because it was romantic or heroic, but because they understood something important. Survival is rarely one big heroic moment. Survival is making the right choice over and over again every single day. Collect water. Keep the fire going. Check on your friend. Stay busy so your mind doesn't turn against you. The obvious lesson here is that humans are better than we sometimes think. But there's a deeper, harder truth. We're not automatically destined to become savage, but we're also not guaranteed to stay decent. What we become under extreme pressure depends entirely on what we choose to build when nobody's watching. What rules do we create for ourselves? What responsibilities do we accept? What stories do we tell ourselves in the dark when the ocean is still roaring just beyond the rocks? On Ada, 6 boys chose again and again to build something resembling civilization out of almost nothing. And that, more than any fictional story about people turning savage on an island, is what should make us pause and think. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear these stories. And if you enjoy true stories that challenge what we think we know about survival, human nature, and the thin line between order and chaos, make sure to subscribe. We have many more stories like this one waiting to be shared.